to talk today about, and this came from one of our career trainee students who sent this to me, thank you very much, about how people became brainwashed. And it's been systematic and very deliberate. And this is what I'm going to share with you today. So I'll just start by saying, last year when all of this started, we were treated to daily press briefings during which we had to listen to the chief criminals in charge, the Scarf Lady, also known as Mrs. Birx, and Mr. Fauci, lie to us about COVID-19 every day. And he still does it. Fortunately, we don't have to listen to her anymore. Well, during one of these, the Scarf Lady declared that there was only one thing that could be done to change the course of the pandemic in the foreseeable future, and that would be to discourage people from violating all the unlawful mandates like mask wearing and social distancing. So in response to this, a guy by the name of Robert Cialdini wrote an article called Advice for Reducing Undesirable COVID Behavior. Now, Cialdini is an academic, of course, who conducts research on how to get people to say yes to things. He's a New York Times bestselling author. He's considered an expert. And gosh, what better person to convince Americans to stop thinking, give up their rights, and follow blindly anything criminals who overthrow our government ask us to do. Well, he starts his article by stating that, quote, "The problem is truly serious, and persuasion scientists like me ought to have something useful to say about it as we begin to emerge from lockdown status. I can offer a pair of recommendations." So the first thing he says, communicators must stop highlighting accounts and images of undesirable behaviors on the part of some citizens. Exercisers crowding hiking paths, revelers packing bars and beaches, many without face masks. Instead, they ought to be featuring the many more of us who are doing the opposite and acting thoughtfully on behalf of the larger community. And then he presents some evidence, which is interesting. So the bottom line is what he's saying is that when people see other people enjoying themselves on the beach and in the bars and going hiking together and no masks and having fun and saying this is bad, obviously looks like those people are enjoying themselves. I'm miserable wearing this stupid mask and standing by myself, so maybe I ought to just disobey too. And I think there's something to that. He says what we need to do is we need to marginalize these people. So he goes through this whole story about the petrified forest near where he lives in Arizona. And one of the things that they have a big problem with there is that people take some of the artifacts. And obviously that's a problem because people shouldn't do that. So a while ago, he says, one of his former graduate students decided to explore the park with his fiance, who he said is the most honest person in the world. And at the park entrance, the couple read the large "No Theft Please" sign. Something in its wording provoked her to respond so entirely out of character that it left her partner stunned. And here's what the sign said: "Your heritage is being vandalized every day by theft losses of petrified wood of 14 tons a year, mostly a small piece at a time." And the honest visitor, girlfriend, said, well, we better get ours too, right? So what was it about the wording, this Robert Cialdini asked, that's the problem? He says, well, it's the force of social norms woefully mispurposed. The wording contained a mistake, a big mistake, often made by well-meaning communicators to mobilize the public against an undesirable activity. They bemoan it as regrettably frequent. And so what he's basically saying is when, our little criminal emperor gets on TV and says that we've got to do something about all the people hanging around in bars maskless, all that does is encourage more people to do it. And I think that's a lesson to us, that what we need to do is lead by example and not go along with this anymore. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So this guy, Cialdini, and his colleagues conducted an experiment, and they were able to reduce the theft of petrified wood by a significant amount. And they did it by setting up an experiment where they used two different approaches at two different entrances to the park. One sign urged visitors not to take wood, but it said few people steal from the park by depicting a lone thief. The sign, which marginalized thievery rather than normalizing it, reduced larceny. And then he goes on to describe in his article other situations in which this has been true. So A few months ago, I'll get to the part that has to do with more with COVID and what we're dealing with. He said, a few months ago, I received a request from the government of Italy for help with the dire situation its people were facing in their COVID-19 cataclysm. One important goal they had was making sure people stick to the quarantine and social distancing. They asked which psychological levers I would recommend pushing. The one I highlighted is communicated social disapproval, which I believe is enormously influential in directing human contact. Once again, here's my evidence. During the most recent portion of my research career, I focused on how to employ persuasion science to move people in more environmentally friendly directions. I've asked the how question in a variety of environmentally relevant domains, but my team and I began by trying to decrease littering in public places. Although we performed more than a dozen experiments, no matter what we tried, we were never able to eliminate littering completely in any condition of any experiment except one. In this study, all participants returned to their cars in a parking lot to find a handbill attached to their vehicle's windshield. We recorded whether they littered the handbill before driving away. If left to their own devices, they did so a third of the time. In a different condition, on their way to the parking area, participants witnessed a man throw a big bag he was carrying into a waste container, which knocked participants' littering rate down to 17%. So in other words, what he's describing is people follow what other people do. In a final condition, as they approached the parking area, we arranged for participants to see a man disapprovingly pick up litter from the ground and deposit it in a waste container. Not one of them littered the handbill after they saw that. To suppress the act of littering, displaying social disapproval of the act was exceedingly effective. So he goes on to say, how could we harness the power of social disapproval to diminish the number of those who disregard proper conduct recommendations in Italy or here? Research by my colleague in the UK, Steve Martin, offers a hint. Steve's team has done studies designed to reduce fare dodging on trains and subways in several cities. One strategy that's proved successful has been to do an initial online survey in which respondents were asked to list a word or words that they would use to describe somebody who didn't pay his or her train fare. Then an information campaign was created in which the public was told the name was nominated most often. It was cheater. The campaign's social disapproval message appearing on signs at train stops and describing the survey's findings significantly reduced the problem. So this guy's doing his psychological warfare game, even in writing this article, implying that people who don't wear their mask and social distance and follow actual scientists who know something about science are the equivalent of people who don't pay their bus or subway fare. So he says something could be done like this by government agencies of any nation fighting COVID-19. The campaign could honestly state that on the basis of the survey, this is the word people will say to themselves about you or out loud to you if they see you violating proper practice. Although I would let the survey results determine the winner, in the war we're waging, I have a hope for that word, collaborator with the enemy. Actually, however, the mask-wearing sheep are the collaborators, in my opinion. And what this guy is doing is despicable. He has been brainwashed. I think it's so interesting that a person who prides himself in his ability to persuade other people to do things has been so easily persuaded by people to follow idiotic advice. I'll never read another book of his again. He's a moron. Anyway, my comment about all of this, he thinks that they should be called collaborators with the enemy. I'll tell you who the collaborators are. It is the sheep who are wearing the masks that perpetuate all of this. Some of you know that I often use World War II analogies to explain my thoughts about things because I see so many different connections in terms of the way things are happening here in the United States and in other places as well. And the bottom line is that the people who helped the Nazis the most were not rabid Nazis, and they certainly weren't rabid Jew haters. They were people who just went along and they let it happen. And in letting it happen, what did they let happen? They let millions of people be slaughtered. 11 million people were annihilated in the camps, in the death camps. And so what could those people have done differently? Just think of how the outcome would have been if instead of saying, put on the star, it'll let you get groceries, Europeans back then, starting with the Germans, actually had some integrity. the public actually had some integrity. And they said, well, if you're putting on a star, I'm putting on one too. We'll all wear stars, and we'll see if these German criminals have the wherewithal to slaughter everybody. We'll all go down together because we will act as one people. We will not let the criminal conspirators who took over our government slaughter some of our own. It would have been an entirely different outcome. But instead, the masks, they didn't wear masks over there. Some people were wearing stars. Obviously, it was a lot easier to find black people and gypsies than it was Jews, but they found those people too and hauled them off to camps. And the people who just watched it happen, they're as guilty as the people who did it. And my thought about this, you know, I don't hate anybody, just so you know. But I can dislike people intensely, and I can also make a judgment of about what I'm observing. I can interpret that. And as I watch the people walking around with masks and that sort of thing, you know, back last year at this time, I kind of understood. I had done a lot more research on all of this than most people. So a person who just didn't know much about it and believed what was going on, I had a lot more patience back then. But right now, with what we know, with what's coming out every day, how can you ignore the data from South Dakota and Florida? Well, you cannot look at it, and that represents a big problem. You can just believe what the mainstream media is telling you, which is false. And that speaks volumes. It basically says, I'm uninterested in checking anything out for myself. Instead, I'm going to be all about calling people names. I'm going to call them collaborators or criminals or cheaters or whatever names they come up with for people who are actually thinking when they're the non-thinkers. So these people, I don't wish them any harm. I think God will take care of them in the end. And I think their conscience will take care of them when they realize what they did. But I've just said to a few people who've interviewed me recently, please don't ask me to have compassion for these poor people. They're not poor people. They're stupid people. And they are doing terrible things by cooperating. And ignorance is not an excuse. Just as ignorance is not an excuse when you're in court defending yourself against a criminal charge, ignorance is not an excuse for aiding and abetting people who are hurting people every day. So I think some lessons to be taken from this. First of all, I find it fascinating that a person who's great at persuasion, or so he says, is so easily persuaded himself. It'll be interesting to see what this guy, he probably will just shut up and disappear after this is all over. Although some of us might gently remind him of what an idiot he was when he wrote this, right? But I think another thing is that we have to recognize the power of disobedience. And the more of us who are disobeying, the better the message is that disobeying is okay. And we can normalize normalcy again by doing this. So this is how they have brainwashed people. They've used psychological warfare to brainwash people. And they didn't brainwash me, and they didn't brainwash you. So obviously not everybody succumbed to it, so it was not inevitable. And that is my point. All right, that's it for now. As